So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about two bosses from Dark Souls 3 DLC. Both of these bosses have a lot of similarities at face value, but they both represent key design elements that I think make great and terrible boss fights. Combat in Dark Souls is really simple. You attack, you dodge, and sometimes you block. You don't need anything more than that. The complexity comes from managing when you attack and dodge, because you have a stamina bar that needs to be tracked at all times, and enemies having a wide variety of moves that you need to be able to recognize in order to dodge properly. I've played basically every single Dark Souls games, so you might be surprised to hear that I don't actually think too highly of a lot of the bosses throughout the series. Sure, there's a lot of decent ones, but there's also a lot of bosses that are just too easy or really poorly designed, and I just want to take a moment to appreciate one good fight and analyze a bad one. So Demon Prince is a boss that, on paper, sounds like a recipe for complete disaster. At least it should for my tastes. It's a multi-phase duo boss against a big guy who flails around and flies through the air a lot. In practice though, Demon Prince somehow manages to be one of the few bosses in Dark Souls 3 that I actively look towards fighting, because when it works, it's fun. When it works. We'll get to that in a moment, because I want to be clear, even though Demon Prince is one of my favorite bosses, it is by no means a perfect fight, and the flaws that Demon Prince has are flaws that are shared throughout a lot of the bosses in the series, especially in Dark Souls 3, and especially in Elden Ring. So the first notable thing about this boss fight isn't even the boss itself, it's that there's a bonfire directly outside of the Demon Prince's arena. This is notable because in the base game of Dark Souls 3, pretty much every single boss has you do a lengthy corpse run if you die to them. Even the tutorial boss against Yurik's Gundyr has a pretty lengthy walk that you have to do every time you die. But if you look at the bosses in the DLCs, you'll notice how pretty much all of them, even the hard ones like Freed and Gale, have their bonfires right next to the boss fogs. This design philosophy is sort of a precursor to the Stakes of Marika in Elden Ring, which are used to cut out corpse runs from a lot of the fights in that game. So it's funny to think that at a certain point, even FromSoft recognized that a lot of players just run past the enemies they so carefully placed throughout the levels, so they just said fuck it, and let the players go straight to the bosses every time. So as you drop down into the Demon Prince's arena, you'll immediately notice that the boss fight begins against two demons. So duo bosses have always been problematic in Dark Souls. When two enemies attack you at the same time, all of the rules and strategies of combat begin to deteriorate. You can't just roll through the enemy's attack and counter them like you can with every other enemy, because the second enemy can just walk up and hit you while you're doing this. You might even get hit during your roll, because the two enemies can layer their attacks so well that they can create a hitbox that you simply can't roll through. This gets even worse when one enemy can use projectiles, which usually makes approaching one of the other enemies even harder, since you'll have to keep both enemies on the camera at the same time in order to keep track of where the projectiles are coming from. With all of these issues together, fighting duo bosses often becomes more about desynchronizing the enemies to give you big openings, or just by abusing ranged attacks. In later Dark Souls games, especially Elden Ring, duo bosses will often forcibly take turns, with one of the bosses standing idle while the other one aggressively pursues you. This style of encounter is better, since now you won't be dealing with the constantly layered attacks, but is so forced that it might as well be the developers admitting that yeah, we can't make this shit work in a balanced way, so just fuck it. Even then, there's still the issue where bosses don't announce which one is aggressive and when they're tagging out. So you'll still need to keep both bosses in your camera's view so you can pay attention to any changes in their AI. So we can finally take a look at Demon Prince and see how this dynamic can be improved. The two demons visually change to represent which mode they're in, and when they change modes, they perform an action that indicates when they've changed and allows you ample time to react to this. The two demons have two modes, melee and ranged. A flaming demon will use melee attacks, and the extinguished one will use range attacks. All of the attacks from the ranged demon are signaled by an audio cue, and even a visual cue that lets the player know ahead of time where the attack is coming from, so they know how to dodge it, even if that demon isn't on the camera. This simple change makes the boss fight so much more tolerable despite being a duo boss, but there is one caveat to this. The demons don't synchronize to each other, and can both be in the same mode at the same time. When both demons happen to be in the melee mode, it creates the same problem as all duo bosses. You can't do anything while both of those enemies are flailing around. On the other hand, when both demons are in ranged mode, you can just walk up and beat the shit out of both of them because neither of them are as aggressive as one melee demon. This sucks all of the challenge out of the fight for a few moments and gives the player a big opportunity to land a lot of hits, but only if you're lucky enough to get this AI to break on you. At the very least, this problem is only temporary, and after a while of running around, the demons will eventually switch modes so you can return to fighting them as normal. But it's a shame that they didn't go through the extra effort to make sure that the AI checks the mode of the other demon so that they can change modes reactively to ensure that this never happens. So let's talk about the actual fight. To get straight to the point, the big reasons that I like Demon Prince is that very little of what the demon does is unfair, and it feels like the developers really thought and cared about how to balance the fight around how long of an encounter it is. Fighting 2 demons and then the final third form is understandably going to take a lot longer than fighting most of the bosses in the game. Not only are there 3 health bars, but the demons themselves are quite durable, even with a fully upgraded weapon or using the element that they're weak to. But what you'll notice early into the fight after getting hit a few times is that they don't do that much damage to you either. They do enough damage to be a threat to you, but compared to a lot of the bosses or even standard enemies in the series, the Demon Prince does shockingly low damage to the player, and this is a good thing. If the Demon Prince did a lot of damage to the player, you would have to go through this entire grueling encounter taking very few hits, which would make it very volatile and very frustrating. There needs to be a balance between how easy it is for you to make mistakes and how much you're punished for those mistakes. You've probably seen some games recently that play on this dynamic to a level of extremity. Games where you're tasked with a seemingly simple and repetitive task, but where a single mistake has potentially massive punishment tied to it. One of the problems I have with Dark Souls often is how unfriendly this process of learning is. When you encounter a boss, you understandably have no idea of how to approach it. You can try and carefully dance around the boss and learn each of the attacks that way, but you aren't building muscle memory by doing that. When you try to engage the boss properly, 1 or 2 mistakes can send you back to a loading screen, and then you go back to the bonfire, and then you have to run all the way back to do your corpse run before you can make another serious attempt at the boss. This is a huge hindrance to how players learn something, because in between moments where they might have something to grasp, they're sent back to a loading screen and have to go through the regular level again in order to try against the boss. So in the case of Demon Prince, by making the prince deal much less damage than usual, it gives the player a lot of opportunities to make mistakes in the first phases of the boss before the second phase comes and ramps up damage and the difficulty. And it should be noted that this boss is not easy because the damage is low. You are fully engaged with the boss and constantly have to recognize attacks and avoid them and then counter back, all while carefully measuring your stamina during the entire encounter. You're allowed to make mistakes in this fight, but this isn't something that you can just flail through and win. You have to pay attention and make the best decisions in each situation in order to come out on top. You being allowed to make mistakes just makes it easier for the player to learn the fight without having to be subjected to nearly as many drawn out "you died" messages and loading screens, but once you've completed that learning step, you still have to complete the actual fight. In addition to the well-tuned numbers, very few of the Demon Prince's attacks feel unfair to dodge. They all have long, clear windups with no Looney Tunes delayed hits, and basically every time the Demon Prince does an attack, you have an opportunity to hit back if you've got the stamina for it. The Demon Prince will also do a long charging attack occasionally, which can be a great opportunity to sneak in some hits and get a riposte if you can recognize this attack and punish it appropriately. As for the flaws with this fight, there are only a few that stick out in my mind. The charging attacks that I mentioned earlier are some of the harder ones to avoid. They also do a lot of damage to the player, and because they only happen in the second phase, it can be more difficult for players to learn this attack without getting obliterated by it on the first go. I don't think every player will know instinctively to run towards the boss to try and stagger them, but if you did manage to get a stagger in the first phase, you'll probably instinctively know to rush towards the boss during this. Another iffy move is the double hand slam during the second phase. This attack raises the Demon Prince so high that you actually can't react to him descending in order to avoid it. You need to delay your roll ever so slightly. This attack isn't the most dangerous, so it's not the worst thing to get hit by, and it's a good example of, again, the difficult attack not instantly killing you with too much damage. Goodbye.
Teleport shit.
I'll be
Oh
honest,
my god.
I just kind of let that happen.
But those attacks are minor issues. The real big problem with this fight is something that plagues the Souls franchise throughout all of its games, especially Dark Souls 3, and especially Elden Ring. The camera is god-awful. The Demon in Pain and Demon from Below are pretty grounded and stable bosses. But there's an issue where if you lock onto the melee demon and he starts moving, the camera moves. When the camera moves, the directions that your character moves relative to your joystick also change. This creates an annoying situation where the ranged demon will spit out an attack at the same time the melee demon starts moving. Your roll to avoid one attack can inadvertently send you careening into the projectile simply because the camera moved in a way you didn't expect to. For the most part, the Demon Prince is small enough to fit his whole body on screen at all times. Even if his arm stretches so far to the sides that it might as well go off screen, his body language is clear and slow enough to let you know how to dodge the attacks that are coming your way. But there is one attack that consistently is made worse by the camera. The Demon Prince will occasionally charge up a fire orb in his hand and leap into the air to throw it down onto you. If you're locked onto the Demon Prince while he's doing this, then almost every time the fire orb will be thrown off camera due to the extreme angle pointing upwards and the prince throwing overhand from behind the sky. You can easily dodge this attack by slightly delaying your roll and using the audio cues, but I think we can all agree that if a projectile is coming your way, you should be able to see it coming, regardless of how much damage it deals. With all that said, the Demon Prince is a fairly well-made boss that's only hindered by a few minor problems. I'm sure some people out there might think that the boss is boring because it doesn't do enough damage to be threatening, and that's fair, I suppose. For me, I think the boss is relatively well designed in its numbers balancing in order to allow such a long, intense fight to still be enjoyable and not frustrating. In my successful attempt to beat the Demon Prince, it took around 8 minutes, which is quite long in my eyes. That didn't make the fight unenjoyable because I felt like the fight was fair, and I was engaged for the whole encounter with how close quarters the Demon Prince is in his attacks. The same cannot be said, however, for the next boss of the discussion. Dark Eater Midir is Dark Souls 3's big black dragon. Every single Dark Souls DLC has had one of these, and Midir comes pretty close to being the worst. While I think Sin is pretty boring, and pretty poorly made for how much time he spends flying through the air like a jackass, Midir seems like he was explicitly designed to piss you off. Let me get one thing clear, I don't care that Midir is supposed to be hard because he's a big dragon, or because he's technically optional. Realism is not an applicable argument here. You can suspend your disbelief here for the sake of making the fight fun for the player, and not thematic to the setting or the story. Midir being optional is not applicable either. You can fight Midir in any playthrough of the game. This is not some kind of opt-in, extra extreme, Dante must die lunatic mode difficulty setting, where it's made explicitly clear from the very beginning that what you're about to do is not intended for all players to beat. If the developers intended for you to beat Urix Gundyr, then they intended for you to beat Midir, but I can tell you now that the developers definitely didn't try to make Midir fun or intuitive to fight. A common criticism I hear of Dark Souls 3 is that it had too many bonfires. Now, I can understand some places where they clearly were some unnecessary bonfires, but to be perfectly honest, I'm not overly bothered by some of them, like the ones before Cathedral of the Deep or the one before Grand Archives. Even though those bonfires are so close to the ones belonging to the bosses you fight right before these places, the more forward bonfires are there so that when you warp there, you don't have to do any pointless running around. As much as I can give Dark Souls 1 credit for its open world being, open, and letting you explore it, you have to admit that there is a lot of running around, and a lot of that running around is you not doing much of anything. So remember when I said that a welcome change is that the bosses in the DLC have bonfires just outside of them to mitigate boring corpse runs? Well, Midir just so happens to be one of the exceptions to that rule, other than Half-Life. Not only did they not give him a bonfire before this fight, but they also made it so that you had to use an elevator and a ladder in order to reach this boss room. Now, to be fair, this isn't the longest run in the world, especially compared to some of the more egregious moments in the series, but there really was no reason for there to not be a bonfire here. There's another minor issue here, and that's the hugeness of the room. Midir is a gigantic dragon, so he needs a large boss room. That's fair, but this clashes with the mechanic in which you drop your souls on your death. If you die to Midir, you might as well forfeit whatever souls you had, because you're not going to run around that massive boss room looking for your bloodstain. This is also a problem with Demon Princes, and is also a problem with Gale, but unlike those two bosses who have bonfires preceding them in order to indicate to you that you should go back to spend your souls, you could stumble upon Midir thinking that it was some kind of dead-end secret, or a side area with its own bonfires, not a fight against one of the most grueling enemies in the entire game. You of course have the option of using a homeward bone to leave the boss with your souls intact, but that's a band-aid solution more than anything. The entire problem could have been avoided if the bloodstain mechanic were reworked, or if they just gave you a bonfire before the boss room. It's also worth noting that this boss room doesn't have a boss fog to indicate that it is a boss, which makes it even more likely for you to not know what you're getting yourself into and potentially lose a bunch of souls to Midir. Side tangent, but I'm not a big fan of the bloodstain mechanic really. All it does is punish beginner players by making it harder for them to accumulate levels. I feel like the notion that losing needs to have a punishment associated with it is greatly exaggerated. When you lose in a game, you usually have to go back and do a level over again. Losing itself is already a punishment, so why implement this extra system that's only frustrating for new players who aren't experienced with what's happening, and does nothing for the pro players who can breeze through the content normally and not be punished by the system? Regardless, let's get back to Midir. Dark Eater Midir is a dragon, and Dark Souls has historically been pretty hit or miss with his dragons. While Calamite was okay, he had a pretty huge health bar and he could spam ranged attacks if you dared put a wall behind you. Sin was far more like a dragon, in the worst way possible. He spends most of his fight flying around like a dog carried on strings like a marionette while he sprays fire down on you, and you aren't allowed to engage with him or punish him after this attack. At best, you waited patiently and baited out a long fire spray attack on the ground, which allowed for a big attack opportunity, but for 80% of the fight, you were running around like an idiot just waiting for this dragon to come down out of the air so you could stab it in the face. Midir just so happens to have both of these qualities paired together. He loves to spam annoying attacks, and he never lets you hit him. Midir's weak point is his face. Very little damage is dealt if you hit him anywhere else, and you only build progress to a stagger if you hit him in the face. So your strategy, like with Sin, is to approach Midir's face after he attacks and then hit him. This is the only practical way to fight Midir, and they managed to screw it up so badly by making it so that many of Midir's attacks force you to run away from him, or force him to run away from you. Even if you know exactly how to dodge Midir's attacks, you probably aren't getting more than 1 or 2 hits on him before he starts revving up for another attack, putting you on the hard defensive. Unlike other bosses, which let you stay close and punish each attack, Midir constantly forces you outside of your striking distance in order to avoid an attack, and this results in a lot of boring downtime during this fight. You don't have to pay attention to your stamina because rather than have to manage balancing, dodging, blocking, and attacking, you just avoid whatever Midir does first by rolling, then you catch up to him by sprinting, and then you attack him once or twice and then recover your stamina. No decision making is really required because Midir dictates the pace of the fight far more than your choices or character building does, and similar to Sin, the best attack to punish Midir is when he breathes fire straight forward, leaving his face close to the ground, but this leads to another issue. Midir's most obnoxious attack is breathing fire straight down onto the ground, which then spills into waves on the floor. You have to run away from this attack when he does it, as rolling through it is simply infeasible. The issue is that Midir is more or less programmed to do this attack on reaction when you get close to his head. If you get bad luck with his AI, you can end up being forced to dodge this attack over and over, and it's a really easy attack to avoid, but doing so is so boring because all you have to do is sprint away and then sprint back every time. Other attacks, like Midir's Drive-By Flame Breath and Shoop-de-Whoop Laser Beam, offer similarly no room for the player to interact and skillfully make damage against Midir. You just have to dodge them. Even if you know exactly how to dodge these attacks, every time as soon as they happen, you don't get to make any progress on the fight by hitting Midir, because he doesn't give you an opportunity to do so, compared to the Demon Princes, which let you stay close to him at all times and get big punishes if you knew how to abuse the big wind-up attacks. In comparison, Midir fails completely at this. The lack of strong punish opportunities gives Midir's fight a sensation that it overstays its welcome and takes too long, but the reality is that it's not actually as bad as it seems. I actually took more time to beat Demon Prince on a successful attempt compared to Midir, about 8 minutes for Demon Prince compared to the 7 for Midir. So the fight isn't literally long, but it just feels so boring and drawn out because so much of the encounter is spent running around, and you'll learn how to dodge Midir's attacks very quickly because of how linear and consistent they are, and unlike Demon Prince, which has intentionally low damage in order to allow you to learn the fight because of how long it is, Midir's damage is notably higher and offers less room to make mistakes over the course of the entire grueling encounter. This is more of an issue when you combine it with a small handful of attacks from Midir which are very obnoxious to avoid, in particular the tail swipe and the dash. The tail swipe is extremely subtle, and players won't know when it's coming the first time. It has a gigantic hitbox, and it has a bad habit of coming out after Midir lunges past you during some of his attacks. If you forget that this attack exists, prepare to lose a third of your health bar, or more. What's even more annoying is the dash attack. Similar to Osiris, Midir can casually just slide towards you at Mach 10, and for some reason this does damage. It makes sense when Midir is far away from you and he does it, which gives you some time to react, but occasionally Midir will just do this attack when when he's extremely close to you and with very little wind-up, making it extremely difficult to avoid. Now let's bring up the issue of the camera again. Midir's hugeness isn't much of an issue when he's standing in front of you, as his most dangerous limbs will be visible to you, but occasionally, Midir will plant himself directly on top of you, making it difficult to see what attacks he's doing. The bigger issue here, pun not intended, is that because Midir is designed to flail around and is absolutely massive in size, locking onto his head is one of the worst things you can do. Not only does it have the issue of suddenly redirecting your movement whenever Midir moves, but because he moves his head so much, it can become genuinely disorienting when you lock onto his head, and the camera starts zooming around like Lakitu just snorted 10 pounds of crack and ate a whole chicken. The game seemingly knows that the camera is absolute garbage during the boss fight, because it constantly unlocks itself when Midir's head moves off of the camera, which happens all of the time. It's like the developers are trying to teach the player in a subtle way that, hey, maybe you shouldn't lock onto this fight, because you're better off not locking on at all during this fight, because if you rely on it, and it happens to unlock at a bad time, you're gonna be lost trying to figure out where Midir is as he starts winding up a big attack. Midir's size compounds the issue with some of his attacks being difficult to read with a poor camera. When you're stuck behind or underneath Midir, reading his body language is near impossible with how close up you are to him. If the camera, zoomed out to capture his whole body in frame, maybe this wouldn't be an issue. But life isn't fair. This is such a common thing in other action games that I'm honestly baffled why FromSoft has insisted on keeping the extremely close-range, cramped, claustrophobic camera throughout all of its games. But I'm sure they fixed this issue in Elden Ring, right? Right?